I remember the weight of the bolt pistol in my hand the first time I tried to kill a man who trusted me. 3 pounds, 7 ounces of consecrated steel and blessed mechanisms. Standard issue commissariat sidearm with my name, Victor Leontovich Cordova, engraved along the barrel in high Gothic script that I'd traced with my thumb 1,000 times during the 6 years of ideological conditioning at the Schola. Progenium. The weapon felt heavier than any lass rifle I'd carried during tactical training. Heavier than the greatcoat draped across my shoulders with its red sash marking me as judge, jury, and executioner for the men I was assigned to lead. The condemned soldier knelt in the mud before me, rain hammering against his shaved skull. Hands bound behind his back with wire that had already cut into his wrists, deep enough that blood ran down his fingers and dripped into the puddles forming around his knees. His name was Jarek Vole. He was 23 years old. He had fallen asleep on watch. The entire 183rd Penal Legion stood in formation behind him. 417 men conscripted from the prison hives of Mordian Septimus. Murderers and thieves and heretics granted one final chance at redemption through military service under the Emperor's mercy. They watched me with eyes that calculated, measured, assessed this fresh-faced commissar barely 25 years old, newly assigned to his first command after graduating in the bottom quartile of his class. The rain fell hard enough to sting the exposed skin, turning the staging ground outside our encampment into a morass of churned mud that sucked at boots and filled the air with the smell of wet earth and human waste from the latrines that had overflowed during the storm. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the faces of men who had killed before, who would kill again, who were trying to determine if their new commissar had the stomach to do what the black uniform and peaked cap demanded. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the Schola's execution chambers, firing into straw dummies and servitor targets while instructors watched and graded my form, my stance, my ability to deliver the Emperor's justice without hesitation or mercy. The doctrine was absolute. Discipline maintained through fear, fear maintained through example, example delivered with a bolt round to the back of the skull at point-blank range. One shot, clean and quick, executed in front of the assembled regiment so that every soldier understood the cost of failure, the price of cowardice, the wages of sin against the Imperium's military hierarchy. I had scored perfectly on every written examination, covering justifications for summary execution. I had memorized 17 different regulations that permitted a commissar to kill his own troops. I had watched picked captures of veteran commissars performing their duty with mechanical precision. Gun raised, shot fired, body falling, formation dismissed, no hesitation, no mercy. No humanity left in the transaction beyond the moment it took for brain matter to exit through a shattered skull. Jarek Vole was crying, not sobbing, not begging, just silent tears running down his face to mix with the rain. His jaw clenched tight enough that I could see the muscles jumping beneath skin scarred by ritual gang markings from whatever hive gang he'd belonged to before his incarceration. He had been awake for 42 hours straight before he fell asleep on watch. The 183rd had been deployed to this Emperor-forsaken mudbowl. Designation: Thraxus Prime, for 16 weeks of garrison duty, while the actual war raged 3 systems away. And the boredom was more corrosive than any combat fatigue I'd read about in tactical manuals. Still, the regulations were clear. Sleeping on watch during active deployment constituted dereliction of duty, punishable by immediate execution. It didn't matter that no enemy had been sighted within 800 kilometers of our position. It didn't matter that the man was exhausted from double shifts covering for soldiers sick with the dysentery that had swept through our barracks. It didn't matter that execution seemed disproportionate to the offense. The Emperor's justice was not proportionate. It was absolute. I raised the bolt pistol, feeling 417 pairs of eyes tracking the movement, hearing the sudden silence as even breathing seemed to stop. The entire regiment holding itself in anticipation of the thunder that would mark their commissar's first kill. My hand shook, not visibly, Not enough that the men in formation would notice, but I felt the tremor running through my forearm, the way my trigger finger refused to settle properly, the sweat making the grip slippery despite the rain. Jarek Vohl's back filled my vision. His sodden uniform stretched across shoulder blades that seemed impossibly fragile, and I thought about the entry wound the bolt round would create, the way it would punch through flesh and bone before the mass reactive warhead detonated inside his chest cavity, the explosive force that would blow his sternum out through his front in a spray of organic matter and uniform fragments. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The rain continued. Lightning forked across clouds the color of old bruises. The bolt pistol remained raised, my arm beginning to ache from holding the position, my breathing shallow and rapid in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. I could feel the regiment's assessment shifting, the realization spreading through the formation like poison seeping into groundwater. Their Commissar couldn't do it. The man responsible for maintaining discipline through lethal force, the figure whose mere presence should inspire terror enough to keep men fighting even when hope was lost. He couldn't pull the trigger. If you've ever felt the weight of a duty you cannot perform, leave broken in the comments below and subscribe, because Victor's nightmare is only beginning. I lowered the weapon. Jarek Vohl collapsed forward into the mud, his bound hands preventing him from catching himself, his face disappearing into the muck as his entire body shook with sobs or laughter or relief. I couldn't tell which. The formation rippled with murmurs, low voices spreading assessment and judgment, the sound building until I had to shout for silence, my voice cracking on the command in a way that undermined whatever authority I might have salvaged. I ordered Vohl to disciplinary stockade instead. 30 days confinement, rations reduced to nutritional minimum, assigned to latrine excavation duty upon release, mercy by commissariat standards, weakness by any other metric that mattered. I dismissed the formation and returned to my quarters, a prefabricated HAB unit that smelled of machine oil and the chemical preservatives used to treat the fungal growth that thrived in Thrax's Prime's humidity. The bolt pistol sat on my desk, innocuous in the yellow light from the single lumen strip overhead. 3 pounds and 7 ounces of metal that had defeated me more thoroughly than any enemy combatant. My hands still shook. I tried to tell myself it was the adrenaline, the natural physiological response to a high-stress situation, but I knew the truth that was already spreading through the barracks. Commissar Cordova was soft. The Schola Progenium had made an error in assessment, graduated a student unsuited for the role's demands, assigned a man with too much conscience and not enough conviction to a position that required absolute certainty in the righteousness of the Imperium's brutal calculus. The reports began 3 days later. Minor infractions at first, soldiers slow to respond to formation calls, uniforms not properly maintained, questioning of orders delivered by squad leaders. Nothing that individually warranted execution, but collectively representing a hemorrhaging of discipline that would metastasize into something fatal if not cauterized immediately. The regimental command staff watched me with barely concealed contempt during briefings. Captain Harrow, nominal commander of the 183rd, though we all understood the Commissar held ultimate authority, making pointed comments about maintaining standards and upholding tradition that were clearly directed. At my failure to execute Vohl, I knew what needed to happen. The next infraction had to end with a body. The regiment needed to understand that my mercy had been anomalous, not representative, that the Emperor's justice would be delivered regardless of my personal feelings. Private Yakov Morek gave me the opportunity 2 weeks after the Vohl incident, drunk on rutgut distilled from the previous week's ration packs. He struck a squad leader who had ordered him to clean his last rifle, not hard enough to injure. But the assault itself was unambiguous grounds for summary execution per 17 different regulations I could cite from memory. I had him dragged to the same muddy clearing, the 183rd assembled in the same formation, the rain replaced by Thrax's Prime's oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to drown in. Morek knelt in the same position Vohl had occupied, though he was belligerent rather than resigned, shouting about injustice and imperial hypocrisy and the corruption of the commissariat, while soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their ranks. I raised the bolt pistol. This time I had rehearsed, had spent every evening since the vole failure in my quarters practicing the draw, the aim, the trigger pull, trying to condition my body to perform the action without thought, to make execution as mechanical as breathing. The weapon felt familiar now, the weight distributed correctly, my stance proper and my breathing controlled. I pressed the barrel against the base of Morek's skull, feeling the warmth of his skin through the metal, close enough that even with my eyes closed I couldn't miss. The trigger resisted under my finger, the bolt pistol's machine spirit requiring proper pressure to prevent accidental discharge, blessed mechanisms ensuring that death required intention rather than mere contact. 4 hours. I stood there for 4 hours, weapon pressed to condemned flesh, while the regiment watched and Morek's shouting gradually subsided into whimpering and finally silence as he realized his Commissar was performing some kind of perverse psychological torture, drawing out the execution to maximize suffering. The sun tracked across the sky. Soldiers fainted from heat exhaustion, standing at attention in full uniform under Thraxis Prime's brutal afternoon sun. Captain Harrow approached twice. First, to ask if I required assistance, then to quietly suggest that perhaps we should postpone the execution until I had regained composure. Both times I waved him away, convinced that any second now my finger would complete the pull, the trigger would break, the bolt round would fire, and this nightmare would end with Morek's brains decorating the mud and my authority re-established through blood and gunpowder. I couldn't do it. Something in my nervous system simply refused the command, a disconnect between conscious will and physical action that left me frozen in place, arm extended, weapon ready. Utterly incapable of delivering the Emperor's justice I was ordained to provide. When I finally lowered the bolt pistol, Morek collapsed forward just as Vole had done, and the regiment's murmurs were louder this time. More open in their assessment, the sound of 400 men simultaneously recognizing that their Commissar was broken. I assigned Morek to stockade as well. 60 days, half rations, disciplinary labor, mercy disguised as punishment, weakness wearing the mask of justice. That night I tried to shoot myself, pressing the bolt pistol beneath my chin and willing my traitorous finger to complete the pull. To spare the commissariat the embarrassment of a failed officer and spare myself the continued humiliation of occupying a role I couldn't perform. But the same disconnect that prevented me from executing others prevented me from executing myself, and I sat on my bunk until dawn with cold metal against my throat. Unable even to grant myself the mercy I'd extended to men who deserved none. The under 183rd fell apart over the following weeks with a speed that would have been impressive if it weren't so catastrophic. Soldiers refused direct orders, knowing their Commissar lacked the conviction to enforce compliance. Fights broke out over minor disputes, the kind of violence that should have been prevented by the implicit threat of summary execution, but now flourished in the vacuum created by my weakness. Equipment went unmaintained. Formations became sloppy. The entire structure of military discipline that separated a functional regiment from an armed mob eroded with each passing day that I failed to pull the trigger, failed to deliver the violence that was my sole reason for existence. Captain Harrow filed the first official report after a sergeant was beaten nearly to death by soldiers he'd ordered to perimeter duty. I was present for the assault, had rushed from my quarters when the shouting started, and had arrived to find 3 men kicking the sergeant as he lay curled in the mud, his ribs already broken, his face a ruined mess of blood and torn flesh. I'd drawn my bolt pistol, ordered them to stop, pointed the weapon at the nearest attacker's head. They had looked at me with contempt so pure it felt like acid on exposed skin, then continued the beating until the sergeant stopped moving. When they finished, they'd walked past me to their barracks, one of them shouldering me hard enough to spin me around, and I hadn't fired, hadn't even attempted to stop them physically. Just stood there with a loaded weapon and absolute legal authority to execute every one of them, and done precisely nothing. The sergeant survived, but would never walk properly again. I assigned his attackers to stockade, 90 days, minimum rations, hard labor. They laughed when I pronounced sentence. Everyone laughed. The entire 183rd had become a joke, and I was the punchline. The commissariat's response arrived 6 weeks into my assignment, delivered by Vox transmission from Sector Command with all the warmth of a guillotine blade. Report for immediate reassignment. No explanation. No formal censure in the transmission itself. That would come later through proper channels. Just the cold abbreviation of bureaucratic disappointment and the coordinates for a transport departure that would occur in 72 hours. Captain Harrow seemed genuinely relieved when I informed him, probably already composing the request for a proper commissar, someone who could do what needed to be done, who could restore order through the application of lethal force that I had proven incapable of providing. I packed my personal effects, mostly books on Imperial doctrine and tactical manuals I'd never successfully applied, and prepared for whatever punishment the commissariat had devised for failed officers. Execution seemed likely, though given my demonstrated inability to pull a trigger, perhaps they'd find some other method. Except the commissariat didn't kill me. They did something worse. Your like could be Victor's only witness. Press it now if you believe some duties destroy the men assigned to perform them. My reassignment orders directed me to Execution Detail Sigma 9, an ad hoc formation attached to the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, operating in the Garon campaign. The title was clinically precise. I was assigned to accompany commissarial execution squads, to observe and document proper procedure, to witness the Emperor's justice delivered by officers capable of performing their duty without hesitation, remedial training, officially, psychological reconditioning through systematic exposure, per internal memoranda that I wasn't supposed to see, but did when the detail's commanding officer, Lord Commissar Brekov, a man whose service record included 347 confirmed executions over a 28-year career, left them on his desk during our initial briefing. They were going to desensitize me by forcing me to watch other commissars do what I couldn't. Repeated exposure to executions, the doctrine suggested, would normalize the act, reduce it to mechanical procedure stripped of emotional weight, transform killing from moral crisis into administrative necessity. The theory was sound, drawn from centuries of commissariat experience in breaking and remaking officers who showed signs of excessive empathy or inappropriate mercy, conditions classified as psychological defects, incompatible with commissarial function. The first execution I observed occurred 3 days after my arrival on Garon IV, a toxic hell world where the atmosphere was technically breathable, but tasted of copper and left your lungs feeling scoured with industrial solvent. The condemned was a corporal from the 47th who had abandoned his position during their Chaos Cultist assault, retreating 200 meters to a secondary defensive line instead of fighting to the death as regulations required. Commissar Yefrem, a compact woman whose service record included tours in 7 different war zones, conducted the execution with efficiency that approached artistry. One shot, center mass of the back. Bolt round penetrating between shoulder blades to detonate directly in the heart, body dropping before the condemned even registered the sound. The entire process took 11 seconds from the order to kneel to the final spasm of dying nerves. Yefrem didn't even watch the body fall, just holstered her bolt pistol and dismissed the formation while servitors dragged the corpse away for processing into protein reclamation. I vomited behind the command bunker, my stomach rejecting the morning's ration pack in violent spasms, while my hands shook and cold sweat drenched my uniform. Lord Commissar Brekov found me there, crouched in my own bile, and his expression contained no sympathy, no judgment. Just the detached assessment of a surgeon examining diseased tissue. Tomorrow, he said, you'll watch another. And the day after that, another. Until watching becomes no different than observing any other aspect of military function. He was wrong, but I didn't realize it yet. The executions continued with metronomic regularity, the Garon campaign's brutal combat generating a steady supply of cowards, deserters, heretics, and incompetents requiring summary judgment. I watched Commissar Yefrem execute a squad leader who had questioned orders to assault a fortified position. I watched Commissar Drovik execute 2 soldiers who had been caught stealing ration packs. I watched Lord Commissar Brekov himself execute a lieutenant who had retreated during an artillery barrage without authorization. Each execution was performed with identical precision, bolt pistol drawn, pressed to skull or spine, trigger pulled, body falling, and each one felt like a physical blow that left me less capable of functioning rather than more desensitized. The problem was that I remembered every face, every name, every detail of the condemned soldiers' infractions and the circumstances that had led to their deaths. Commissar Yefrem killed without seeing individuals. She saw military assets that had malfunctioned, components that required replacement, problems solved through application of violence. But I couldn't stop seeing the humanity, couldn't stop constructing narratives around each condemned soldier, where they'd come from, who they'd left behind, what minor sequence of decisions or misfortunes had culminated in them kneeling in the mud while a commissar raised a bolt pistol to their skull. Private Marcos Venn, executed for sleeping through morning formation, 20 years old, conscripted from a manufacturer where he'd worked 90-hour weeks before the tithe claimed him, probably suffering from exhaustion, but regulations made no allowance for such mitigating factors. Sergeant Chloe Dens, executed for failing to prevent soldiers under her command from looting civilian supplies. 34 years old, veteran of 6 campaigns, killed not for her own crime, but for the crimes of subordinates she couldn't control every moment. Corporal Jane Threx, executed for spreading defeatist rumors. 18 years old, barely trained before deployment, probably just expressing fear rather than actively undermining morale. But distinctions like that didn't matter when the bolt round fired. I started keeping a journal, writing down their names, their ages, the specific regulations that justified their executions, and the details I observed in the moments before they died. The journal filled quickly. 5 pages after the first week, 20 after the first month, 50 after 6 weeks. Lord Commissar Brekov discovered it during a surprise inspection of my quarters and read through several pages while I stood at attention, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. When he finished, he looked at me with something approaching pity, rare and unwelcome from a man who'd killed hundreds without apparent difficulty. "You're supposed to forget them, Cordova," he said, dropping the journal on my bunk. "That's the entire point of the exercise. You watch enough men die that death becomes background noise, indistinguishable from the sound of lass fire or the rumble of artillery. Instead, you're preserving them, memorializing the very compassion we're trying to excise." He was silent for a long moment then. "You're getting worse, not better. The commissariat will need to know." I was transferred to Execution Detail Tertius, 7, after 3 months on Garan IV, this time attached to the Valhallan 12th operating in the frozen wastes of Mordecane. The logic was that a change in environment might somehow succeed where the previous assignment had failed, as if watching men die in the snow would be fundamentally different than watching them die in toxic mud. It wasn't. Commissar Grevin executed soldiers with the same precision as Yefrem and Brekov, and I recorded their names with the same compulsive need to remember what everyone else was trying to forget. The second journal filled faster than the first, then the third. By the time I was transferred to my 4th execution detail assignment, this time observing Commissar Volkmar attached to the Mordian Iron Guard fighting orc invasions in the Skelos system, I had documented 473 executions in exhaustive detail, their names and faces haunting my sleep when I could sleep at all, which was increasingly rare as the nightmares became more vivid than the waking hours. Comment where you're watching from, if you've ever been trapped in a cycle of witnessing horror you can't prevent. Victor needs to know he's not alone in this. The commissariat's psychological evaluation after 8 months of execution detail assignment was 13 pages of clinical language describing my persistent empathetic dysfunction and pathological inability to compartmentalize necessary violence. The examining medici, an ancient woman whose augmetic eyes never blinked, asked me a series of questions while monitoring my physiological responses via sensors attached to my temples and chest. Did I understand why executions were necessary? Yes. Did I acknowledge that military discipline required lethal enforcement? Yes. Could I articulate the doctrinal justifications for summary justice? Yes. And I proceeded to cite 17 different regulations without hesitation. Did I believe the soldiers I'd watched die deserved execution? I hesitated on that one, and the sensors registered my uncertainty like a seismograph recording tremors before an earthquake. You intellectually comprehend the necessity, the Medicae concluded, but you lack the emotional detachment required for implementation. This makes you unsuitable for commissarial duty, but insufficiently psychologically damaged to warrant medical discharge or euthanasia. You exist in a liminal state, too broken for your assigned function, too functional to dispose of. She paused, her opmetic eyes whirring as they focused. The commissariat has decided to attempt field reintegration. You'll be assigned to a new regiment with explicit instructions to perform at least one execution within the first 30 days, or face permanent removal from service. Permanent removal. That was euphemism for execution, which meant the commissariat had finally lost patience with their failed officer and was granting one final opportunity to prove I could do the job I'd been trained for or die in the attempt. I should have felt relief, an end to the nightmare one way or another, but instead I felt only numb acceptance as I received my new assignment, Commissar, attached to the Penal Legion 49th. Deployed to compliance operations on Tertius Hive, expected arrival in 6 weeks via warp transit. The 49th was smaller than the 183rd, only 238 men. But their reputation was somehow worse. A collection of murderers and rapists and heretics granted dubious redemption through military service that mostly involved suppressing civilian uprisings on planets too minor to warrant deployment of actual Guard regiments. The commanding officer, Captain San, greeted my arrival with barely concealed hostility and a comment about hoping you last longer than the previous Commissar, which I later learned had been executed himself after being discovered selling regimental weapons to local gangs. I tried. The Emperor knows I tried. When Private Torvek refused a direct order to clear a hab block suspected of harboring seditionists, I had him dragged to the regimental assembly area, forced him to his knees, pressed my bolt pistol to his skull. The entire 49th watched with the same calculating assessment I'd seen in the 183rd, measuring their new commissar against the standard of violence they'd been conditioned to expect. My hand didn't shake this time. 8 months of watching executions had at least steadied my grip, but the same fundamental disconnect remained. I stood there for 20 minutes before Captain San quietly suggested we postpone the execution until I'd reviewed proper procedure, which was polite phrasing for acknowledging that their commissar was broken. I assigned Torvek to stockade. The 49th fell apart even faster than the 183rd, discipline collapsing within 2 weeks as soldiers realized their supposed enforcer lacked enforcement capability. When I tried to execute a sergeant who'd struck a subordinate, I stood frozen for an hour before dismissing the formation. When I tried to execute a corporal who'd abandoned his post, I couldn't even raise the weapon, my arm refusing the command like a servitor with corrupted programming. The commissariat recalled me after 37 days. I hadn't completed a single execution. My failure was absolute and now officially documented, my personnel file thick with reports from commanding officers and psychological evaluations, all reaching the same conclusion. Commissar Cordova was fundamentally unsuited for his assigned role, but the commissariat had invested too much in his training to simply dispose of him without exhausting every remedial option. So they sent me back to execution details. Commissar Breck this time, attached to the Katachan III Regiment fighting in jungle hell worlds, where the vegetation was more dangerous than the enemy combatants. I watched him execute soldiers for infractions ranging from cowardice to incompetence to simply being in the wrong place when an example needed to be made. My 6th journal filled, then my 7th. The nightmares intensified. Faces of the executed appearing in my sleep with increasing clarity, their voices asking why I'd watched them die, why I'd documented their deaths but done nothing to prevent them, why I existed at all if not to deliver the Emperor's justice I was supposedly ordained to provide. The pattern established itself with grinding inevitability, assignment to execution detail, months of observing other commissars kill with mechanical precision. Psychological evaluation documenting my continued failure to develop appropriate emotional detachment, reassignment to active regiment with orders to execute, inability to perform, regiment discipline collapse. Recall to execution detail. The cycle repeated with minor variations in location and commanding officers but fundamental sameness in outcome. Each iteration adding more names to my journals, more faces to my nightmares. More weight to the realization that I was trapped in a role I couldn't perform but couldn't escape. Desertion meant execution. Medical discharge required psychological damage severe enough to render me non-functional. But the commissariat's Medicae insisted I remained capable of performing my duties despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. Transfer to another branch of Imperial service was impossible. Once assigned to the commissariat, departure occurred only through death or catastrophic physical injury that left you unable to maintain minimum physical standards. I was imprisoned by bureaucratic inertia, a failed officer circulating through remedial programs that couldn't fix what was broken, condemned to eternally watch others do what I couldn't. Eternally fail when given opportunity to prove I'd learned, eternally return to watching again. If you think 15 years of this cycle would break anyone, hit the like button and subscribe, because Victor's torture is far from over. 3 years into the cycle, I'd observed 1,427 executions across 17 different execution details and 11 attempted regimental assignments. My journals filled an entire trunk, thousands of pages documenting names and faces and final words, and the specific trajectory of bolt rounds through condemned flesh. I could recite execution procedures from memory, could describe in technical detail the optimal shot placement for different weapon types, could articulate the philosophical justifications for summary justice with the fluency of a scholar instructor. But I still couldn't pull the trigger. 5 years. 2,819 executions witnessed, 23 attempted regimental assignments, each ending in failure and recall. The commissariat had tried different therapeutic approaches, extended sessions with confessor chaplains who attempted to frame execution as holy duty rather than murder, pharmaceutical interventions that were supposed to suppress empathetic response, but mostly just made me nauseous. Even experimental neural conditioning that involved mild electrical shocks paired with images of executed soldiers in an attempt to create aversive associations that would make witnessing death less traumatic. Nothing worked. If anything, I got worse. The pharmaceutical interventions triggered panic attacks. The neural conditioning gave me migraines that lasted days. And the chaplains eventually gave up after I broke down crying during a session about the Emperor's mercy being reserved for those who served without question. 8 years, 4,163 executions, 37 regimental assignments. I'd been transferred so many times that soldiers started recognizing me, the broken commissar who circulated through different regiments like a cautionary tale. Present just long enough to demonstrate his inability to perform before being shipped to another execution detail. Some soldiers found it amusing, others found it disturbing. A few found it somehow inspiring, as if my inability to kill represented some kind of resistance to the Imperium's grinding brutality, which was grotesque misinterpretation of weakness as virtue. 10 years, 5,708 executions, 49 regimental assignments. I'd stopped trying to hide my journals, carrying them openly in the trunk that accompanied me to every posting, adding pages with mechanical regularity while commanding officers watched with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Lord Commissar Brekov, who I encountered again during my 7th return to execution detail duty, had aged significantly, his face more lined and his movements stiffer, But he still executed soldiers with the same precision I'd first witnessed on Garon IV. He asked to see my journals during a rare moment of privacy in his command bunker, reading through several volumes while I stood silent. "You've documented nearly 6,000 executions," he said finally, his voice rougher than I remembered. "More than most commissars will personally perform in their entire careers. You've witnessed more death than officers 3 times your age. And yet you still can't," he trailed off, shaking his head. "The commissariat made an error with you, Cordova. Not in training. Your technical knowledge is impeccable. The error was in selection. Some men simply lack the capacity for this work, and no amount of conditioning or exposure can create what doesn't exist in the first place. You should have been screened out at the Schola. Spared this," he gestured at the journals. "Nightmare you've been living." "Why don't they discharge me?" I asked. The question had haunted me for years, but I'd never voiced it directly to a superior officer. If I'm fundamentally unsuited, why continue the charade? Brekhov's laugh was bitter. Because the commissariat doesn't admit mistakes. Because discharging you would require acknowledging that their selection process failed, that their remedial programs don't work, that sometimes you can't condition a man to kill on command, regardless of how much pressure you apply. Easier to keep you in circulation, documentation accumulating, until you finally die in some combat action, or your heart gives out from stress, or you succeed in whatever suicide attempt I'm certain you've already considered. He handed the journals back. "You're a ghost, Cordova. An error the system can't correct, so it just persists with you, hoping time or attrition or sheer accumulated trauma will eventually resolve the problem." 15 years. 8,492 executions witnessed across more execution details and regimental assignments than I could track without consulting my personnel file, which had grown thick enough to require its own data slate. I was 40 years old, looking at least a decade older, my hair gone prematurely gray, and my hands developing a tremor that never quite disappeared, even when I wasn't holding a weapon. The nightmares had evolved from simple replays of executions into elaborate scenarios where the condemned soldiers spoke to me, asked me why I'd failed them, why I'd watched them die without intervention, why I continued existing in a role that caused only suffering, both to the regiments whose discipline collapsed under my watch, and to myself, trapped in perpetual failure. I tried to explain this during a psychological evaluation to a different Medicae, a younger man whose augmetic arms clicked and whirred as he took notes. "The condemned aren't asking you those questions," he said, with the patronizing tone of someone who'd never witnessed an execution. "You're asking them to yourself, projecting your own guilt and inadequacy onto imagined conversations with the dead. The solution is clear. Stop watching executions. Request permanent assignment to Execution Detail Command Staff, administrative duty that doesn't require direct observation." But the commissariat wouldn't grant that request. Administrative assignment was reward for successful service, not accommodation for failure. I was sentenced to continue the cycle, watch executions until psychological evaluation. Attempt regimental command until failure, return to execution detail, on repeat until death or miraculous reformation, neither of which seemed imminent. The worst part wasn't the executions themselves. I'd seen so many by this point that the physical act had become almost abstract. Bolt rounds and falling bodies and spreading blood reduced to mechanical sequence my brain processed without conscious engagement. The worst part was the hope that preceded each new regimental assignment, the desperate belief that maybe this time would be different, that some fundamental shift had occurred during the months of watching other commissars kill, that when I raised my bolt pistol and pressed it to condemned flesh, my finger would complete the pull, and the nightmare would finally end. It never did. Every regimental assignment followed the same trajectory. Arrival with good intentions and determination to perform my duty. First infraction requiring execution. Bolt pistol raised and held while I stood frozen. Inability to pull the trigger. Assignment to stockade instead. Regimental discipline collapsing as soldiers recognized their commissar's weakness. Increasingly severe infractions as men tested boundaries. Eventual recall after my failure became undeniable. The cycle was so predictable that I started recognizing the pattern's beats before they occurred, knowing with certainty that I would fail but powerless to alter the outcome. Subscribe if you believe some prisons have no bars. Victor's been trapped for 15 years in a cycle no key can unlock. The Penal Legion 71st was my 68th regimental assignment. Deployed to suppress civilian riots on Crondis 7, a manufacturing world where the workers had stopped production after a tithe increase made their already brutal conditions literally fatal. The Legion was smaller than most I'd served with, only 147 men. But their reputation was somehow darker. Whispers about mass executions and civilian massacres and violations of imperial law so severe that even the local Arbeits had filed complaints. Captain Vaughan, their commanding officer, had survived 4 previous commissars, which suggested either exceptional competence or exceptional skill at arranging accidents for officers who interfered with his operations. He made no effort to conceal his contempt during our first meeting, reading my service record with open disgust. 67 previous assignments, he said, not bothering to look up from the data slate. Average duration 18 days before recall, not a single completed execution in 15 years of service. You're not a commissar, Cordova. You're a bad joke the commissariat keeps telling because they've forgotten the punchline. He finally met my eyes, his gaze flat and calculating. I requested a proper commissar. They sent you instead. So here's what's going to happen. You'll stay in your quarters, you won't interfere with operations, and when the inevitable recall comes, you'll report that the 71st maintained excellent discipline under my command. In exchange, I won't arrange an accident that solves everyone's problem with your continued existence. Understood? I should have agreed. Should have taken the offered arrangement and spent another 2 or 3 weeks in comfortable isolation before the commissariat recalled me to another execution detail. But 15 years of accumulated failure had created a kind of desperation, a need to prove to myself, if no one else, that I wasn't completely worthless, that some aspect of commissarial duty remained accessible even if execution was beyond my capability. So I refused Vaughan's offer and insisted on accompanying the 71st during their riot suppression operations, determined to at least perform the observational and morale functions that technically fell within a commissar's responsibilities, even if the lethal enforcement aspect remained impossible. The riots had consumed 3 entire hive sectors by the time we deployed. Millions of workers refusing to return to the manufacturums after the increased tithe demands made it mathematically impossible to afford both food and housing on the wages provided. The situation was objectively unjust. I'd reviewed the economic data during transit, and the numbers confirmed that the tithe increase would result in mass starvation. That the workers' refusal was survival response rather than sedition, but imperial law made no distinction between justified and unjustified resistance. Production had stopped. Order had collapsed. The Imperium's response was to send penal legions to restore compliance through whatever violence proved necessary. The 71st's approach was systematic and brutal. Hab blocks suspected of harboring riot organizers were surrounded, all exits sealed, then cleared room by room with lasfire and grenades. Civilians who surrendered were processed for labor camps. Civilians who resisted were killed immediately. Civilians who weren't clearly doing either, which included most of the children and elderly, were shot anyway because Captain Vaughan's standing order was maximum lethality, minimum discretion. I watched from command positions during the first 3 days of operations, documenting what I witnessed with the same compulsive detail I'd applied to execution observations, filling pages with descriptions of atrocities that violated so many regulations I stopped trying to count. On the 4th day, during the clearing of Habitation Sector Gamma, 4-7, I witnessed a corporal from the 71st execute an elderly man who'd been trying to surrender, hands raised, clearly unarmed. Not heat of battle killing, but deliberate murder. The corporal walking up to the man and shooting him in the face at point-blank range while laughing about cleaning up refuse. That was the moment something finally broke. Not the disconnect that prevented me from executing soldiers, but some other structural element of my psychology that had kept me compliant despite 15 years of accumulating horror. I drew my bolt pistol and aimed it at the corporal's back. The weapon felt familiar in my hand, the weight and balance no different than the thousands of times I'd raised it toward condemned soldiers without firing. But this time the targeting calculation was different, not executing a soldier under my command for military infractions, but stopping an atrocity in progress, preventing murder that served no tactical purpose and violated every principle the Imperium supposedly represented. My finger found the trigger. The corporal turned, noticed me aiming, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to dawning realization. Other soldiers stopped their clearing operations, weapons lowering as they watched their commissar finally about to shoot someone after 15 years of documented failure. I couldn't pull the trigger. The same fundamental disconnect that had prevented me from executing sleeping sentries and insubordinate soldiers and actual criminals prevented me from stopping a murder happening right in front of me. The corporal's confusion transformed into contempt as seconds stretched into minutes, and my bolt pistol remained unfired. He turned his back on me deliberately, a gesture of dismissal so absolute it was almost physically painful, and continued clearing the hab block while I stood frozen, weapon raised, completely impotent. Captain Vaughan found me like that 2 hours later, still standing in the same position with my bolt pistol extended toward empty space. The corporal long since moved to a different sector. "I tried to spare you this," Vaughan said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Offered you an arrangement that would have let you avoid witnessing what compliance operations actually entail. But you insisted on accompanying us, on maintaining the pretense that you're a functional commissar rather than a broken mechanism the commissariat keeps running because they don't know how to dispose of you properly." He pushed my bolt pistol down, the gesture almost tender. "File your report. Document the atrocities. Send it to whatever commissariat officials you think might care. They won't. They'll add it to your file. Note another failure to maintain regimental discipline and assign you to another execution detail where you can spend 6 months watching proper commissars do what you can't before shipping you to another doomed regiment. That's your existence now. That's all it will ever be." He was right. I filed the report, 17 pages of detailed documentation about the 71st's systematic violations, included specific names and timestamps and regulations breached. The commissariat's response came 3 weeks later. Recall to execution detail Omega. 1-3, attached to the Vostroyan firstborn fighting Tyranid incursions in the Hadros sector. Expected departure in 5 days. No acknowledgement of my report's contents, no investigation into the 71st's operations. Just reassignment back to the cycle, another rotation of watching executions I couldn't perform, waiting for the next regimental assignment I would inevitably fail. If Victor's helplessness to stop atrocities resonates with your own experiences of powerless witnessing, leave complicit in the comments. Sometimes watching is its own form of guilt. Execution Detail Omega. 1-3 was led by Commissar General Strakov, a legend within the commissariat whose service record spanned 43 years and included over 900 personal executions plus countless more authorized under his command. He was 71 years old, his body more augmetic than organic after injuries sustained in dozens of campaigns, his face a mask of scar tissue that made reading his expressions nearly impossible. He reviewed my file during our first meeting, taking nearly an hour to read through the accumulated documentation of my failures, while I stood at attention in his command bunker, deep within a Vostroyan trench system that smelled of frozen earth and Laskan discharge. 15 years, he said finally, his voice mechanically modulated by Vox Augmetics. 8,492 executions observed. 68 regimental assignments, every one ending in failure. Psychological evaluations documenting persistent empathetic dysfunction, with no improvement despite sustained remedial intervention. He set the data slate down. You're a unique case, Cordova. Most officers who demonstrate execution incapacity are identified and removed during scholar training. The few who slip through are typically corrected during their first assignment or discharged as psychologically unsuitable. But you've persisted, neither fully functional nor completely broken, trapped in liminal state that defies standard remedial protocols. I've requested discharge 47 times, sir, I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the desperation beneath the words. Medical separation, administrative reassignment, even penal service as a regular soldier rather than officer. Every request denied. I'm aware I'm unsuitable for commissarial duty. I've been aware for 15 years. But the commissariat won't release me. Strakov's obmetic eyes, dull red lenses that whirred as they focused, studied me with inhuman precision. Because releasing you establishes precedent. If the commissariat admits that their selection and training protocols can produce an officer fundamentally incapable of performing core duties, it undermines the entire system's credibility. Better to keep you in circulation indefinitely, a problem without solution, than acknowledge the system failed. He was silent for a long moment. I'm going to try something different with you, Cordova. Instead of merely observing executions, you're going to participate in them. My stomach dropped. Sir, I've attempted execution 68 times across different regimental assignments. You've attempted to execute soldiers under your command, Strakov interrupted. Individuals you'd presumably developed some rapport with, however minimal. Different psychological dynamic than executing condemned soldiers you have no relationship with, who are already restrained and processed through military justice proceedings. You'll serve on execution squads, performing supporting roles initially, restraining condemned, confirming identity, verifying execution completion, gradually increasing participation until you're comfortable performing the execution itself. Comfortable. As if 15 years of documented trauma could be resolved through incremental exposure, as if proximity to killing would somehow transmit capability through osmosis. But Strakov was a Commissar General, his authority absolute within this operational theater, and refusal would constitute insubordination that even I, dysfunctional as I was, couldn't justify. So I agreed, and 3 days later found myself part of a 5-person execution squad, preparing to carry out sentence on a Vostroyan soldier convicted of desertion during a Tyranid assault. My role was minimal. Hold the condemned soldier's shoulders to keep him properly positioned, while Commissar Loev delivered the killing shot. Simple task, physical rather than moral, no different than the hundreds of times I'd stood witness during previous execution details. Except it felt completely different. The condemned soldier, Private Hansk Terov, age 22, conscripted from the ice fields of Vostroya Prime 18 months before, was close enough that I could feel him shaking, could hear his breathing rapid and shallow, could smell the fierce sweat soaking through his uniform. My hands pressed on his shoulders, holding him in place, and I realized with sickening clarity that I was physically facilitating his execution. That my presence and participation were necessary components of the killing about to occur. Commissar Loev pressed his bolt pistol to the base of Terov's skull. I felt the barrel's cold metal through my grip on the condemned soldier's shoulders, felt the flinch when steel contacted skin, felt the desperate tension in Terov's body as he tried not to move, tried to die with whatever dignity regulations permitted. Loev pulled the trigger. The bolt round punched through skull and brain with explosive force that I felt through my hands before I heard the sound, the impact transmitting through bone and tissue, and my palms like touching a drumhead when it struck. Terov's body went instantly slack, the transition from living to dead occurring in the space between heartbeats. And then he was just weight collapsing forward that I had to catch and lower to the ground, while blood spread across frozen mud in patterns I'd seen hundreds of times before, but never from this proximity. I vomited immediately after, my body rejecting the physical intimacy of the killing in ways that mere observation had never triggered. Commissar Loev waited until I finished, then handed me a ration bar and a flask of recaf. "Your first time participating rather than observing," he said, not unkindly. The physicality is always harder than watching from a distance. But you performed your role adequately. Tomorrow, you'll hold the condemned shoulders again, and again the day after, until holding becomes routine rather than traumatic. Then we'll advance your role. The advancement was gradual and methodical. After 2 weeks of holding condemned soldiers' shoulders during executions, I was promoted to confirming identity, checking the condemned's identification tags against execution orders, verifying that the correct soldier was being killed, rather than administrative error, sending an innocent to death. After another 2 weeks, I was responsible for verifying execution completion, examining the body after shooting to confirm death had occurred, checking for any remaining signs of life that would require a second shot. Each role brought me incrementally closer to the act of killing itself, exposure therapy designed to normalize participation through repetition. It didn't work. Every execution I participated in added to my nightmares, faces and names accumulating with the same compulsive detail my journals had documented for 15 years. The physical proximity made everything worse. I could feel them dying now, not just watching, but touching, holding, confirming, participating in ways that made me complicit in manner observation never had. I started having panic attacks during executions, my breathing becoming rapid and my vision narrowing to a tunnel, while my heart hammered so hard I thought my ribs would crack. Commissar Loev would have to physically steady me, his grip on my shoulders mirroring my grip on the condemned, while I fought to maintain enough composure to complete whatever minimal role I'd been assigned. Commissar General Strakov observed one of my panic attacks during an execution where I was supposed to verify completion. I'd knelt next to the body, a sergeant named Volkov, who'd been convicted of incompetence after his squad was overrun by Tyrannid Hormagaunts, and my vision had narrowed until all I could see was the exit wound, the way the bolt round had blown through his face, the biological reality of death rendered in tissue and bone and blood that was still spreading across ground frozen too hard for it to sink in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the simple binary determination of alive or dead that was my only responsibility. Loev had to pull me away and complete the verification himself while I sat in the mud trying to remember how to breathe. "You're getting worse," Strakov said during the debriefing that evening, his mechanical voice somehow conveying disappointment despite its flat modulation. Participation was supposed to normalize the process, reduce psychological distance that makes execution impossible. Instead, you're developing acute stress responses to proximity. Your case is genuinely unprecedented, Cordova. Most officers either adapt to execution requirements or break completely. You've done neither, just persisted in this liminal state of dysfunction for 15 years without improvement or catastrophic deterioration. "Then discharge me," I said, not caring anymore if the desperation showed. "Medical separation on psychological grounds. Assign me to whatever menial role you want, logistics, administration, data processing. I'll serve the Imperium faithfully in any capacity that doesn't require killing or watching others killed. Just release me from this cycle." Strakov's augmatic eyes studied me for a long moment. "I'm going to recommend exactly that," he said finally. "Not because I believe you deserve mercy, but because your continued circulation through remedial programs wastes resources and demoralizes the officers assigned to rehabilitate you. The commissariat should have discharged you a decade ago. With my recommendation, they might finally acknowledge the obvious. Hope is a cruel thing to experience after 15 years of its absence. I allowed myself to believe that Strakov's recommendation would succeed where my 47 previous discharge requests had failed. That Commissar General authority would override whatever bureaucratic inertia kept me imprisoned in this role. The recommendation was filed through proper channels. 17 pages of detailed documentation arguing that I represented unique case requiring non-standard resolution, that my continued service as Commissar caused more harm than benefit, that discharge with assignment to administrative duty served the Imperium's interests better than perpetual rotation through remedial programs. The commissariat's response arrived 6 weeks later. Request denied. No explanation, no alternative proposed, just 2 words that extinguished whatever hope Strakov's recommendation had kindled. I was reassigned to Execution Detail Tertius. 1-9. Different theater, but same function. The cycle continuing unbroken despite a Commissar General's intervention. Strakov showed me the denial notice personally, his mechanical face unreadable, but something in his posture suggesting genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Cordova," he said. "I thought my authority would carry a weight sufficient to override bureaucratic intransigence. I was wrong. You're trapped in this cycle until you die or the Imperium falls, whichever comes first. If you've ever felt trapped in a system that refuses to release you despite obvious unsuitability, hit the like button now. Victor's prison has no walls, but it's more secure than any fortress. 18 years, 11,347 executions witnessed or participated in across 74 regimental assignments and 23 execution details. I was 43 years old, looking ancient, my hands shaking constantly now, my sleep rarely lasting more than 2 hours before nightmares jerked me awake. The journals filled 3 trunks, thousands of pages documenting names and faces, and the specific ways men died when bolt rounds or last fire or power swords ended their existence. Some execution details had tried to confiscate the journals, arguing they represented security risks or evidence of psychological instability. But I'd always managed to retain them through appeals to regulations, protecting personal effects, or simply hiding volumes until transfer orders came through. The journals were all I had. Physical proof that the men I'd watched die had existed, that their deaths meant something beyond administrative notation and casualty reports, that someone remembered their names, even if everyone else had forgotten. I read through them sometimes during the long hours between executions, trying to recall faces that had blurred together into composite nightmare, trying to distinguish Private Venn from Private Terav, from Sergeant Volkov from the hundreds of others who died while I watched, or held their shoulders or verified their corpses were properly dead. Some of the journals had developed quasi-religious significance during my circulation through different posts. Soldiers would ask to see them, treating the volumes like sacred texts, finding the names of comrades who'd been executed years before in previous regiments. Word had spread through some informal network that connected penal legions and guard regiments across different sectors. Cordova keeps the names. Cordova remembers. If you want someone to remember your death, make sure Cordova's there to witness. It was grotesque canonization, transforming my dysfunction into something almost holy, as if my inability to execute made me uniquely qualified to memorialize the executed. I tried to explain this to the medici during one of my increasingly frequent psychological evaluations, how the journals had evolved from personal coping mechanism into something larger, how soldiers treated me as a kind of confessor despite my total inability to grant absolution or prevent the executions they confessed knowing they might eventually face. The medici, a different one each evaluation. The commissariat apparently rotating through their entire psychiatric staff, trying to find someone who could diagnose whatever was wrong with me, listened with professional detachment, and noted persistent delusional significance. Attribution, in my file, which I suppose was accurate from certain clinical perspective. 20 years, 14,208 executions, 82 regimental assignments. I'd been transferred so many times that I'd started encountering the same regiments on 2nd or 3rd rotations. Officers I'd served with years before now encountering me again and realizing their broken commissar was still circulating through the system, still failing to execute. Still documenting deaths in journals that had become legendary in some circles. Captain Vaughan, who I'd served under in the 71st Penal Legion and who'd arranged transfer to the 63rd after his previous unit was disbanded, actually laughed when he saw me assigned to his command again. "Cordova," he said, shaking his head, "still alive, still broken, still keeping those damned journals. How many volumes now?" 97, I answered. 3 trunks wasn't sufficient anymore. I had to requisition a 4th, which had required paperwork justifying why a commissar needed so much personal storage. 97 volumes documenting men you watched die but couldn't save, Vaughan said. Must be comforting, having records of your failures organized so meticulously. He wasn't being cruel, just stating facts with the bluntness that came from having survived too many deployments to bother with polite fictions. I'm not going to pretend you're a functional commissar this time. You'll stay in your quarters, you'll keep your journals, you won't interfere with operations. And when the inevitable recall comes, we'll both file reports saying everything was fine. Sound reasonable? It was. More than reasonable. It was mercy, allowing me to simply exist without the pretense of performing duties I couldn't execute. I agreed, and spent 6 weeks in quarters while the 63rd conducted compliance operations I didn't witness, writing in my journals, reading through previous volumes, existing in a kind of suspended animation that was almost peaceful compared to the horror of active participation in executions or regimental command. But peace wasn't sustainable. The commissariat recalled me to another execution detail, this time attached to the Mordian Iron Guard fighting orc incursions in a sector I'd served in twice before. The executions continued with metronomic regularity, my participation roles cycling through the same sequence Strakov had initiated years earlier, holding shoulders, confirming identity, verifying completion. I documented each execution with the same compulsive detail, the journals growing thicker, the nightmares more vivid, my hands shaking harder until I had to start taking stims just to write legibly. 22 years, 16,734 executions, 91 regimental assignments. I was 45 years old, looking elderly, my hair completely white now, and my face carved with lines that made me seem twice my actual age. The psychological evaluations had become almost perfunctory, Medicaid going through diagnostic motions without real expectation of finding anything new. Their reports documenting the same persistent symptoms with slight variations in clinical language but fundamental consistency in conclusion. Unsuitable for commissarial duty, insufficiently damaged to warrant discharge. Recommended continuation of remedial programs pending improvement or catastrophic deterioration. Neither occurred. I just persisted, a ghost circulating through the commissariat systems, too dysfunctional to serve but too functional to dispose of, accumulating documented failures like some soldiers accumulated commendations. My personnel file was larger than some regimental histories, data slates filled with reports from commanding officers, psychological evaluations, execution detail assessments, discharge request denials, reassignment orders. If someone wanted to study commissarial dysfunction, my file provided comprehensive documentation of what happened when the system failed to identify and remove unsuitable candidates during training. The commissariat seemed aware of this, occasionally assigning junior officers to review my case as training exercises in recognizing and managing persistent psychological issues. These officers would read through portions of my file, interview me about specific incidents, then write reports analyzing where remedial interventions had failed and proposing alternative approaches. Their recommendations were always the same: discharge with administrative assignment, or, failing that, permanent assignment to execution detail observation rather than rotating between observation and failed regimental commands. The commissariat always denied these recommendations, though no one could explain why beyond vague references to maintaining system integrity and preventing precedent establishment. Subscribe if you believe Victor's story needs to be witnessed, because after 2 years, he's still trapped in a cycle that should have ended decades ago. 25 years. 19,812 executions witnessed or participated in across 107 regimental assignments and 31 execution details. I was 48 years old, my body starting to fail in ways that had nothing to do with combat injuries. The constant stress had damaged my cardiovascular system, irregular heartbeat, high blood pressure, circulation problems that left my extremities often numb. My digestive system had developed ulcers from years of stress and irregular rations consumed during transfers between assignments. My vision was deteriorating faster than normal aging should account for, though the Medici couldn't identify specific pathology beyond stress-induced ocular degeneration. Most concerning were the cognitive symptoms. My memory was becoming unreliable for anything except the executions I'd witnessed. I could recall in perfect detail the face of Private Venn executed 23 years ago, but couldn't remember what I'd eaten for breakfast, or the name of the current execution detail's commanding officer. My concentration would fragment during briefings, awareness drifting until someone would have to physically shake me to regain attention. Sometimes I would lose track of time, discovering hours had passed while I sat staring at nothing, my consciousness simply absent for extended periods. The Medicaid documented cognitive deterioration consistent with sustained traumatic stress exposure and recommended medical discharge on grounds of diminished capacity. The Commissariat denied the recommendation. I was still capable of performing execution detail observation duties, therefore insufficiently impaired to warrant separation. The fact that I'd been incapable of performing actual commissarial duties for 25 years was irrelevant. As long as I could stand, watch, and document executions, I remained technically functional within my assigned role. I started wondering if the Commissariat was conducting some kind of long-term study, using me as experimental subject to determine the upper limits of psychological endurance under sustained exposure to executions. It would explain the meticulous documentation, the rotating Medicaid assessments, the continued denial of discharge despite overwhelming evidence of unsuitability. Maybe I was valuable not as Commissar but as data point, my accumulated suffering providing information that would improve future training protocols or remedial programs. The thought should have angered me, but I'd exhausted anger years ago, moved past it into numb acceptance of my role as permanent failure, eternal witness to deaths I couldn't prevent and couldn't perform. The journals had become physical burden that required dedicated servitors to transport between assignments. 134 volumes across 4 trunks, weighing nearly 200 kilograms total. The pages representing more man-hours of writing than some soldiers spent in active combat. I'd started numbering the executions sequentially rather than just recording dates and names. Execution number 14,237. Private Gorm Kellis, age 19, executed for insubordination, single bolt round through posterior skull. Death instantaneous, reducing human death to enumerated data points that were somehow easier to process than acknowledging the individual tragedies each number represented. During my 112th regimental assignment, attached to the Cadian 201st operating in the Damocles Gulf, the commanding officer, Colonel Hendricks, a practical woman who'd served in 7 different war zones, asked to see the journals after hearing rumors about their contents. I showed her all 134 volumes laid out in chronological order across the floor of my quarters, and she spent 3 hours reading through selected entries while I waited in silence. "This is madness," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Not the documentation itself, the fact that you've endured this for 25 years. No one should carry this much death in their memory. No one should be forced to witness thousands of executions across decades when they clearly lack the psychological capacity to process the trauma. This isn't remedial training. It's torture." "I've made that argument in 47 discharge requests," I replied. "The Commissariat disagrees." "Then the Commissariat is wrong." She was silent for a moment. "I'm going to file a report demanding your immediate medical discharge on humanitarian grounds. Use my authority as regimental commander to argue that your continued service represents abuse of an impaired officer." "It might not succeed, but—" "It won't succeed," I interrupted. "Commissar General Strakoff tried something similar 8 years ago. Request denied. The Commissariat doesn't discharge officers like me, where errors they can't correct and won't acknowledge, so we just persist. Until we die or break completely, or the Imperium ends. Those are the only exits available." Colonel Hendricks filed the report anyway. The commissariat denied it 6 weeks later with the same two-word response that had greeted every previous discharge attempt. Request denied. I was recalled to another execution detail, my 34th, attached to forces fighting Tyranid incursions in a sector I'd served in 4 times before. The cycle continued, unbroken and apparently unbreakable. My existence reduced to perpetual circulation through execution details and failed regimental assignments, while the journals documented deaths that no one but me remembered or cared about. 28 years, 22,941 executions, 119 regimental assignments. I was 51 years old, my body failing with accelerating speed. The cardiovascular problems worsening until I required daily medication to prevent heart arrhythmia. The cognitive deterioration progressing until I sometimes lost track of what year it was or which execution detail I was currently assigned to. The Medicaid assessments documented severe physical and psychological impairment inconsistent with continued military service. The commissariat continued denying discharge requests. I'd stopped trying to understand their logic, stopped trying to appeal or argue or convince anyone that my continued service benefited no one and harmed both myself and any regiment unfortunate enough to receive me as assignment. I just existed, moving between posts as ordered, observing executions as required, documenting deaths in journals that now numbered 168 volumes across 5 trunks. The servitors assigned to transport my personal effects had started treating the trunks with quasi-religious reverence, handling them carefully and sometimes asking permission to read entries about executions they'd witnessed in previous postings. During my 126th regimental assignment, I encountered Lord Commissar Brekov again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. He'd aged significantly, now in his late 80s, more augmatic than organic. His movements slow and his voice mechanically filtered, but he still executed soldiers with the same precision I'd first witnessed on Garan IV 33 years before. He recognized me immediately, despite the decades, his augmetic eyes focusing with mechanical precision on my face, before widening slightly in what might have been surprise. "Cordova," he said, after a moment. "Still alive. Still in service. Still," he trailed off, seeming to recalculate his assumptions about my continued existence. "I thought you'd be dead by now. Combat casualty or stress-induced cardiac failure or suicide. But you're here, decades later, looking ancient but still functioning." He paused. "How many executions have you witnessed now?" 22,941. I answered automatically. The number was always current in my mind, updated with each new entry in the journals. 22,000. Brekov's mechanical voice processed the number slowly. "That's more than any commissar in active service has personally performed. You've witnessed more death than officers who've served twice as long, who've participated in the galaxy's bloodiest conflicts. And you still can't execute a single soldier yourself." "No, sir." What else was there to say? Brekov was silent for a long moment. "I told you decades ago that you were an error the system couldn't correct. I was wrong. You're not an error, you're a feature. The commissariat keeps you in circulation not despite your dysfunction, but because of it. You're a warning to other officers. Fail to execute, and this becomes your existence. Decades of watching others do what you can't. Perpetual rotation through remedial programs. Eternal service in a role you're completely unsuited for. You're more effective as cautionary tale than you ever were as commissar." He was probably right. I'd never considered that my suffering might serve pedagogical purpose, that junior commissars being trained in execution procedures were told about Cordova, the officer who couldn't pull the trigger and spent 3 decades paying for that failure. It would explain the commissariat's refusal to discharge me. My continued existence provided object lesson more valuable than any doctrinal lecture about the necessity of summary justice without hesitation or mercy. If you think using a broken officer as decades-long cautionary tale is grotesque even by 40K standards, leave example in the comments and hit subscribe. because this is what the Imperium does to failures it can't eliminate. 30 years. 25,816 executions, witnessed across 134 regimental assignments and 38 execution details. I was 53 years old, barely functional. My body held together by medications and augmetic interventions that the Commissariat authorized, not out of concern for my well-being, but to maintain my capability to continue observing executions. My heart had required pacemaker implantation after 2 cardiac arrests during execution details. My vision had deteriorated until I needed corrective augmetic lenses to read the journals. My hands shook so badly I could barely write anymore, forcing me to dictate new journal entries to recording devices for later transcription. The cognitive deterioration was worst. I would lose hours or days, awareness fragmenting until I'd discover myself in different locations with no memory of transit between assignments. Names and faces blurred together, not just the executed soldiers I'd witnessed dying, but also commanding officers, fellow commissars. Even my own identity sometimes felt uncertain. As if Victor Cordova was just another name in the journals rather than the person documenting them. The medici described this as dissociative symptoms secondary to prolonged trauma exposure and recommended immediate psychiatric hospitalization. The commissariat denied the recommendation. I was still technically capable of execution detail observation, therefore discharge or hospitalization was unnecessary. The fact that I was barely conscious half the time, that my memory was fragmenting, that I sometimes couldn't remember my own name. None of that mattered as long as I could stand in formation and watch bolt rounds destroy human skulls, while some part of my fractured consciousness documented the death for journals no one except scattered soldiers ever read. I started hallucinating. Not dramatic visions or religious revelations, just quiet presence of the executed, standing in my peripheral vision, their faces matching the descriptions I'd written in the journals. Private Venn from 30 years ago, Jerick Vole from my first failed execution, Sergeant Volkov whose death verification had triggered my panic attack, Marcos Venn and Chloe Denz and Jane Threx and hundreds of others whose names I could recite from memory, even though I couldn't remember what I'd eaten or what year it was or which execution detail I was currently attached to. The medici documented trauma-induced hallucinations and prescribed antipsychotics that made the hallucinations less vivid, but also made me more nauseous and did nothing to address the underlying problem of 30 years' worth of accumulated death compressed into psychology that had never developed proper compartmentalization mechanisms. I stopped taking the medications after 2 weeks, preferring the hallucinations to the chemical fog that made even execution observation difficult to focus on. During my 141st regimental assignment, the commanding officer, Captain Shen, who'd specifically requested me after reading reports about the journals, asked if I would perform a memorial service for soldiers killed in combat. Not executed, actually killed in battle against Orc forces, honorable deaths that warranted recognition rather than the shameful deaths I'd spent 3 decades documenting. I initially refused, explaining I had no authority or training in conducting memorial services, but Shen insisted that a commissar who'd remembered 25,000 executed soldiers was uniquely qualified to honor soldiers who'd died fighting. The service was simple. I read names from the casualty reports, 37 soldiers killed in the previous week's fighting, and spoke briefly about each one based on their service records. Nothing elaborate, just acknowledgement that they'd existed, they'd served, they'd died. The assembled regiment listened with attention I'd never experienced before, soldiers actually focusing on words I spoke rather than dismissing me as the broken commissar too dysfunctional to execute. After the service, soldiers approached individually to thank me, to tell me about comrades who'd been executed in previous postings, and ask if I'd documented their deaths in the journals. I had. The journals were comprehensive, including every execution I'd witnessed across 3 decades. And soldiers would ask permission to read the entries, to see their dead comrades remembered by someone who'd actually witnessed their final moments. It was grotesque and moving simultaneously, transformation of my documentation of failure into something that provided meaning for soldiers who'd lost friends to the commissariat's brutal justice. Captain Shen offered me a permanent position as regimental chaplain rather than commissar, arguing that my inability to execute was less relevant than my apparent ability to provide memorial function no one else performed. The commissariat denied the transfer request. My duty was execution detail observation and periodic regimental assignment attempts, not memorial services, regardless of whether the latter served the Imperium's interests better than the former. I was recalled to another execution detail 3 weeks after the memorial service, the cycle continuing with grinding inevitability. 33 years, 28,492 executions, 147 regimental assignments. I was 56 years old, looking ancient, my body more augmatic than organic now, held together by imperial technology that prevented death but couldn't prevent suffering. The journals numbered 209 volumes across 6 trunks, their combined weight exceeding 300 kilograms. The servitors assigned to transport them had started treating the trunks as sacred relics, refusing to let anyone else handle them, sometimes requesting permission to add their own notations about executions they'd witnessed that I hadn't documented. I couldn't write anymore. The hand tremors too severe, so I dictated journal entries to recording servitors who transcribed my words in script more legible than my own handwriting had ever been. The entries were becoming less detailed, my memory failing to retain the specific particulars that had made early volumes so comprehensive. Names and faces blurring into composite descriptions, soldier executed for cowardice, bolt round through skull. Death instantaneous, without the individualizing details that had characterized my documentation for decades. The hallucinations intensified, not just peripheral presences anymore, but full conversations with the executed, their voices as clear as any living soldier's, asking me questions I couldn't answer. Why did you watch us die? Why did you document our deaths but not prevent them? What was the point of remembering if you couldn't save anyone? I tried to explain to the hallucinations or to myself, the distinction increasingly unclear, that remembering was all I could do, that documentation was the only form of mercy available to an officer incapable of execution but equally incapable of preventing executions others performed. During the psychological evaluation, my God Emperor knows which one, they'd all blurred together. I asked the medici if I was dying. Not the body, which was obviously dying, held together by augmetics and medications and imperial technology that prevented physical failure, but the consciousness inhabiting the failing body, the person who'd once been Victor Cordova before becoming a cautionary tale about commissarial dysfunction. Was that person dying, finally eroding after 33 years of accumulated trauma? The medici was silent for a long moment, his augmetic senses scanning my physiology. Neurologically, you're exhibiting patterns consistent with severe dissociative disorder and possible pre-dementia cognitive decline. Psychologically, you meet criteria for at least 6 different trauma-related diagnoses. Philosophically, he paused, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. I think the person you're asking about died decades ago. What remains is the function, the observation, the documentation, the memorial, the system consuming the man, leaving only the role. He was probably right. I couldn't remember who Victor Cordova had been before the first failed execution, before the first observed death, before the journals and the nightmare cycle and the realization that escape was impossible. That person was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. What remained was the Commissar who couldn't pull the trigger, but couldn't stop watching others pull it, documenting deaths across 3 decades. Perpetual witness to violence I was ordained to deliver, but psychologically incapable of performing. Now you understand what lies beneath the Imperium's justice, the eternal suffering of a man trapped between duty and incapacity. If you dare witness more truths about what the Emperor's service truly costs, subscribe. The Emperor protects, but from Victor's fate there is no protection. 35 years. 30,783 executions witnessed, 159 regimental assignments, I'm 58 years old today, or perhaps 59, the records are unclear and my memory can't be trusted, and I've been recalled to another execution detail, my 40th. Attached to forces I don't recognize, fighting enemies I can't remember. The journals now number 247 volumes, their weight requiring 8 servitors for transport. Their contents known to soldiers across dozens of sectors who treat the volumes like holy texts, preserving the names the Imperium forgets. I can feel myself disappearing. Not dying, the augmetics and medications won't allow that, but dissolving, consciousness fragmenting into observation and documentation, while whatever constituted my individual existence erodes like rock underwater. Slow but inevitable. Sometimes I forget I'm human rather than recording servitor, just another machine documenting military operations for Imperial archives. Sometimes I forget the difference matters. Lord Commissar Breckhoff died 3 months ago. I received notification via standard casualty report. 92 years old, killed during orc assault on his command position. The report noted he'd performed his final execution 2 hours before his death, maintaining perfect precision until the end. I envied him that, the ability to perform his duty without hesitation until the moment combat killed him. He'd died a proper commissar. I would die a cautionary tale, assuming I'd died at all instead of just persisting forever in this liminal state between living and dead. New recruits arrive at the execution detail every few months, fresh from the Schola Progenium, young officers full of conviction and certainty about the righteousness of imperial justice. Their instructors tell them about me, the broken commissar who's observed 30,000 executions but never performed one, the officer who served 35 years in perpetual rotation through remedial programs, the cautionary tale about what happens when you hesitate during your first execution. Some of them approach me afterward, asking questions about my experience, trying to understand how someone could fail so completely yet continue existing. I don't have good answers. I tell them about the first execution I attempted, about Jarek Vole kneeling in the mud while I stood frozen with bolt pistol raised. I tell them about the second attempt, the 4th hour of standing with weapon pressed to condemned flesh, the realization that some fundamental component of my psychology simply couldn't complete the action. I tell them about the journals, the names and faces preserved across 35 years, the memorial function that evolved from personal coping mechanism into something soldiers across the Guard treat as sacred. Some of them understand, most don't. They see dysfunction where I've tried to create meaning, see weakness where I see the preservation of memory in a system designed to erase individual deaths beneath the weight of imperial necessity. A few ask to read the journals, flipping through volumes and finding names of soldiers they recognize, comrades executed in previous postings. Those officers sometimes thank me, acknowledging that remembering matters even when preventing death is impossible. But mostly they just note the cautionary tale and resolve to pull the trigger without hesitation when their moment comes. To execute cleanly and quickly, and without the emotional entanglement that destroyed Commissar Cordova's career and condemned him to 35 years of watching others do what he couldn't. Which is probably the Commissariat's intention. Use my failure to ensure future generations don't repeat it. Yesterday I observed execution number 30,783. Private Helm Kendris, age 21, executed for desertion, killed by Commissar Yakov with single bolt round through posterior skull. Death instantaneous. Today I'll observe execution number 30,784. Tomorrow another. And another until my body finally fails despite the augmetics, or until the Imperium falls, or until I simply cease existing as anything except function. The eternal witness, the perpetual observer, the commissar who couldn't execute, but can't stop watching executions. The Emperor protects, they say, but there is no protection from this, no mercy in the machine, no escape from the cycle that's consumed 35 years and will consume however many remain until my consciousness finally erodes completely, and what's left is just recording servitor wearing a commissar's uniform. Documenting deaths for journals no one will read. Preserving names the Imperium has already forgotten. Witness to violence I was ordained to deliver, but forever incapable of performing. This is a service. This is sacrifice. This is what it means to fail in the Imperium's brutal hierarchy. I am Commissar Victor Leontovich Cordova. I have observed 30,783 executions across 35 years of service. I have never pulled the trigger. I never will. And the cycle continues forever.